We met at a gas station off Highway 19. I needed a ride. He had an old van and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. I didn't know then that a few hundred miles later, I'd be questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. The highway stretched endlessly, a silver thread unraveling beneath the dusty wheels of an old microbus that hummed like it had its own heartbeat. Aaron sat quietly in the passenger seat, his camera resting on his lap, the strap twisted between his fingers like a lifeline. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the countryside in hues of gold and rust, bathing everything in soft light. The windows were rolled halfway down, letting in the scent of warm asphalt and pine. It had been less than 24 hours since Aaron had accepted a ride from a stranger named Silas at a remote fuel station just outside New Cairo, a town so small it didn't even show up on his GPS. He hadn't planned this journey. In fact, very little in his life lately had followed a plan. He had told himself this trip was about capturing landscapes, but deep down he knew he was trying to outrun a quiet storm inside him. Silas drove one-handed, his elbow hanging lazily out the window, tapping his fingers against the wheel in rhythm with a song that barely played through the van's static-filled speakers. The vehicle wasn't in perfect condition. It rattled at every bump and leaned slightly left, but it had character. Inside, it felt more like a moving cabin than a car. Worn books lined a narrow shelf above the window. A hammock net held up bags of clothes and supplies, and fairy lights curled loosely around the roof beam. A faded map of the Pacific states had been taped to the ceiling. They hadn't talked much since they left. Silas seemed comfortable in silence, and Aaron had no desire to break it. Words felt too sharp lately, too fragile, as if speaking would expose the confusion he carried like a weight under his ribs. Instead, he watched the world slip by, the changing trees, the shifting light, the occasional blur of signs for towns he didn't know and might never visit. There was a strange comfort in the movement, in the hum of tires on pavement, the occasional clang of dishes clinking in the back of the van, and a faint scent of sandalwood that seemed to linger around Silas. Aaron found himself drawn to these tiny details, the pieces of someone else's world that made his own feel less cluttered. At one point, they passed a field of sunflowers, their faces tilted westward. Silas slowed the van slightly, as if to appreciate the view without saying anything aloud. Aaron reached for his camera, but didn't lift it. Some things didn't need to be captured, just remembered. They pulled over as the sun began to sink completely, parking beside a small overlook with a view of an empty valley. The land stretched far, scattered with trees and distant rooftops that shimmered under the fading sky. Silas stepped out to stretch and check the back tires, while Aaron stayed inside, tracing patterns on the window fog from his breath. It wasn't cold yet, but there was a chill that hinted at autumn's arrival. Silas reappeared and opened the side door, letting in the breeze. He didn't speak, just settled onto a folded blanket with a thermos in hand. Aaron joined him, resting his back against the frame of the van. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world had gone quiet. No other cars, no phones ringing, no one expecting anything from them. In the fading dusk, Aaron studied the way the light touched Silas's profile. The curve of his jaw, the strands of hair curling against his temple, the steady rise and fall of his chest. It was nothing, and yet it meant something Aaron didn't have words for. He thought about all the nights he'd spent awake in his apartment back in Westridge, wondering if he'd ever feel whole, wondering why silence there felt suffocating, while this one, shared with a near stranger in a dusty van, felt grounding. As darkness folded around them, Silas lit a small camping lantern. The warm glow pushed shadows to the corners of the van, casting the space in amber. Aaron noticed the way Silas's hands moved, deliberate but relaxed, like someone who had long ago stopped rushing. The moment wasn't monumental. It was quiet, still, unspectacular to anyone else. But to Aaron, it felt like the first exhale after months of holding his breath. He didn't know how long the journey would last, or where exactly they were headed. The only certainty was the road, the van, and the strange comfort of Silas's presence beside him. And for the first time in a while, that was enough. The next day began with soft rain tapping gently against the windows of the microbus, like a lullaby for the restless. Aaron woke up curled beneath an old wool blanket, the scent of cedar and gasoline lingering faintly in the air. Silas was already outside, his silhouette visible through the fogged windshield, stretching in the damp morning air. The world around them was washed in gray-blue. Trees swayed in the mist, and puddles formed unevenly along the roadside. There was something comforting about it all, as if the rain gave them permission to slow down. Aaron stayed inside a while longer, watching the droplets chase each other down the glass. He found peace in their rhythm, something gentle to hold onto while his thoughts continued their quiet war. Sleep hadn't cleared the confusion. If anything, it had deepened it. Last night's silence had felt safe. Now, it felt heavy, like a question left unanswered. Eventually, he stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he walked toward the edge of the overlook where Silas stood, sipping from a tin mug. They didn't exchange greetings. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. They packed slowly and resumed their drive, winding through forest roads that twisted like ribbon. The van creaked around sharp bends, and the windshield wipers kept their steady metronome. Music played softly in the background, instrumentals mostly, quiet enough not to disturb the silence they both seemed to need. Aaron kept stealing glances at Silas when he thought it was safe. There was something about the way Silas focused on the road, the way his fingers moved in rhythm to the song, that stirred something unfamiliar in him. Not loud or obvious, just a slow, warm hum beneath the surface. He wasn't sure what it meant. He'd always struggled to name his feelings. They came in shades and textures, not words. But whatever it was, it lived in the space between them now. Every time their shoulders brushed as the van shifted on uneven ground, every time their eyes met for a fraction too long, it echoed. They stopped briefly near a wooded rest area to stretch and eat. Silas brought out a small camping stove and heated up a simple meal, canned beans and bread. They sat on a flat rock, sharing the food, the drizzle having faded into a soft breeze. Aaron noticed how close they were sitting. Not quite touching, but closer than strangers. He could feel the warmth of Silas's presence like sunlight on skin, subtle, but impossible to ignore. He told himself it was just comfort, just company on a long road. But he wasn't sure he believed it. As they ate, Aaron's thoughts drifted. He thought about the things he hadn't said, the moments he had buried under silence. He remembered high school locker rooms and the way he had avoided eye contact, the fear of being seen too clearly. He remembered friendships that faded when his emotions grew too complicated. And now here he was, sitting beside a man who didn't ask questions, who didn't demand answers, just shared the road, the food, the air. Later, back on the road, the landscape began to change. The trees gave way to open plains, and the sky stretched wide and pale above them. Silas adjusted the mirrors and hummed along to a folk song playing through the static. Aaron stared out the window, tracing invisible shapes on the glass. He thought about how, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to pretend. With Silas, he didn't have to talk to be heard. He didn't have to explain the silence. It was simply accepted. He remembered something Silas had said the night before, while they sat near the van. Some people only find peace when they stop running. At the time, Aaron hadn't responded. But now, those words looped in his mind like a soft refrain. They reached a quiet roadside pull-off just before sunset. Fields of golden grass stretched endlessly on either side, and the air smelled of sage. They parked facing west, letting the last light spill into the cabin. Silas stepped out and leaned against the van. Aaron followed, standing a few steps away. The sky burned orange and pink, clouds stretching like brushstrokes. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too sharp for a moment this soft. Instead, he glanced sideways. Silas looked peaceful, like he belonged to the sky and the road in equal measure. Aaron realized in that quiet moment that he didn't want this ride to end, not because of the destination, but because of who was sitting beside him. There was still distance between them, yes, but something was shifting, slowly, quietly, like the light just before dusk. They stood there until the sky faded into indigo and stars began to emerge one by one. The days began to blur, stitched together by the sound of tires on pavement and the muted buzz of distant towns rolling past their windows. The microbus had become more than a vehicle. It was a world unto itself. In its walls, Aaron felt suspended, caught between where he came from and a destination he hadn't yet named. Each morning followed a quiet rhythm. Silas would rise first, boiling water for coffee on the small stove nestled between the passenger seat and a crate of cooking supplies. Aaron would stay under the blanket longer than necessary, not out of laziness, but because he liked listening, hearing the soft clatter of tin cups, the familiar hiss of boiling water, the rustle of Silas moving around without needing to speak. They spoke less as the days passed, but not out of discomfort. In fact, the silence had taken on a kind of intimacy. It was in the way Silas would hand Aaron a cup of coffee without a word, or how Aaron would instinctively hand him a spare towel after washing at a roadside spigot. These gestures were small, but they meant more than the words either of them avoided. One evening, the rain returned. It wasn't a storm, just a steady drizzle that blanketed the world in soft gray. They parked beneath a cluster of old pines along an empty stretch of the interstate. The sky was too cloudy for stars, and the only light came from a single lantern hung inside the van. Aaron sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a tattered book he had found wedged between the seats. It was a travel journal, filled with faded handwriting and pressed wildflowers. Someone else's memories. He liked the idea of it, leaving pieces of yourself behind in the form of pressed petals and ink. Silas was reclined on the bench seat-turned bed, his arms folded behind his head. He stared at the ceiling as if it were a sky he was trying to read. Occasionally, the van would creak as it shifted slightly in the wind. Outside, the forest murmured in soft rustles and dripping branches. Aaron felt the question forming long before he asked it, but it stayed buried. There were too many things he wanted to say, yet none of them felt safe out loud. He could feel the pull again, the strange gravity that existed whenever Silas was near. It wasn't just admiration. It wasn't just comfort. It was something deeper, quieter, something that lived in the space between heartbeats. He remembered, suddenly, a moment from childhood, being caught in a summer storm with no umbrella. The sky breaking open above him, the air thick with rain and static. This felt like that, as though something was about to happen, even if he didn't know what. Later, as the rain softened to a whisper, Silas sat up and reached for his old, beat-up guitar. He strummed a few uneven chords, nothing polished, just a lazy tune that matched the rhythm of the moment. Aaron didn't recognize the melody, but it didn't matter. It wasn't for performance. It was just something Silas needed to let out. The music filled the van like incense, curling into corners and hovering in the air. Aaron closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. He thought about how long he had been searching for something like this. Not the music, but the stillness it created. The way it made space for feelings that didn't have names yet. When the last note faded, neither of them spoke. Silas set the guitar aside and leaned back again. His eyes found Aaron's for a moment, just a flicker of contact, but it lingered. Aaron felt the heat rise to his face and quickly looked down. He wasn't sure what Silas saw in him in that moment, but whatever it was, it made the silence feel heavier. Not in a painful way, but in the way that silence can stretch when it's filled with unspoken truth. Later, as they prepared to sleep, Aaron found himself unable to settle. He lay facing the back wall of the van, eyes wide open, listening to the breath of the world around them. Every now and then, he could hear Silas shift, adjusting the blanket or exhaling slowly. He wondered if Silas was awake too. There were no answers. Not yet, but there was something undeniable building between them. Aaron didn't know what shape it would take or whether it was welcome, but it was real, and it was growing stronger each day. They left the forest behind just after sunrise, with morning fog clinging to the windows like breath on glass. The road now carved through open land, scattered with quiet hills and skeletal trees stripped bare by the season. The microbus hummed along steadily, cutting through the silence of early day. Aaron sat in the passenger seat, absently watching the mirror. Silas was focused on the road, both hands on the wheel, his face calm but unreadable. The van rattled gently, and Aaron could feel each bump beneath them like soft reminders that they were still in motion. It had been 2 weeks since they'd started this journey, though it felt both shorter and longer. Time had become strange, elastic, almost dreamlike. Each day passed in a haze of golden hours and dim evenings, but something inside Aaron refused to settle. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. A low hum had taken up residence in his chest, something restless and growing. It stirred whenever Silas brushed past him to reach the sink, when their hands grazed exchanging a cup of tea, when they laughed at the same song lyric at the exact same time. These were small things, but they carried more weight than they should have. By late afternoon, they pulled into a tiny roadside town. Nothing more than a general store, a gas station, and a diner with flickering signage. They parked in a gravel lot behind the diner and went inside to escape the wind. The place was nearly empty, lit by yellow bulbs that buzzed faintly overhead. Aaron took the booth by the window, and Silas joined him, dropping his coat beside him on the seat. They ate quietly. Aaron barely touched his food. His appetite had become unreliable, just like his thoughts. Every time Silas looked up, Aaron found himself averting his eyes. The space between them on the booth's bench felt strangely charged, like a wire pulled too tight. He wasn't sure if Silas noticed, but part of him suspected he did. Silas wasn't the type to ask questions right away, but he noticed everything. Back in the van, the sky had darkened. Dusk always came too early now, stealing light before they were ready. Silas adjusted the heater while Aaron curled up on the bench seat, legs drawn close, blanket draped over him. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the branches of a tree that tapped lightly against the roof. That night, the silence between them returned, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Aaron could feel it pressing in on all sides. He watched Silas from across the van, taking in the subtle lines of his profile, the curve of his mouth as he read something on his phone. The lantern cast soft shadows across his face, making him look almost unreal. Aaron looked away, ashamed of the way his thoughts had begun to orbit Silas with more and more gravity. It was as if something had tilted inside him, subtly, but completely. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected it, and yet it felt less like discovery and more like recognition, like something in him had always known but never had a name for it. He stood abruptly, muttering something about needing air, and slid the door open. Cold air slapped his skin, but he welcomed it. Stepping outside, he walked a short distance toward a row of silent trees, their dark branches swaying in the wind. He didn't go far, just enough to be alone. A minute passed, then another. Behind him, he heard the door creak open, followed by the sound of footsteps. He didn't turn. Silas's voice came low, quiet. "You've been distant." Aaron closed his eyes. He didn't know how to answer that, not without unraveling. More silence. Then, finally, "I know." That was all he could manage. Just that small, fragile truth. And somehow it was enough. Silas didn't push, didn't demand an explanation. He just stood beside him, facing the same wind, the same dark road ahead. They stayed like that for a while, saying nothing. When they eventually returned to the van, Aaron felt a strange kind of calm settle in his chest. It wasn't resolution, but it was release. A loosening of something knotted tight. Inside, the lights were dimmed. The van creaked in the wind like it was breathing with them. Silas sat down and pulled out an old flannel shirt, tossing it to Aaron without a word. Aaron caught it, surprised, then gave a faint smile. That gesture said more than either of them could have said out loud. He wrapped the shirt around himself and sat back down. The distance between them hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like a wall. Now, it felt like a question waiting for its answer. The next morning began with soft frost on the windows and a pale sky stretched wide and quiet. Aaron sat on the edge of the van's makeshift bed, watching his breath cloud in the air. The heater hadn't kicked in yet, but he didn't mind the chill. It made everything feel more real, more immediate. Silas was outside, brushing off the windshield with the edge of his sleeve. The sun hadn't risen fully, and the world still felt half asleep. Aaron wrapped the flannel shirt tighter around himself, breathing in the faint scent of campfire smoke and pine that clung to the fabric. Something had shifted between them the night before, not with fireworks or sudden declarations, but in the silence they had shared beneath the trees. It was the kind of moment that lived in the pause between words, the kind that lingered long after. By midday, they were back on the road. Hills rolled past the windows, and a line of faded telephone poles followed them like shadows. The van creaked and rattled as usual, but Aaron hardly noticed. He kept glancing at Silas, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes focused, expression calm in that quiet way Aaron had come to admire. There was a kind of gravity to him. Not loud, not demanding, just present. Silas had never tried to change Aaron, never pushed, never prodded. He simply allowed space for Aaron to exist. And in that space, Aaron had discovered parts of himself he didn't know he'd buried. They stopped later that afternoon, near an overlook where the world dropped away into a sprawling canyon of gold and red rock. The air was dry, crisp and still, a place where time felt slower, where breath came deeper. Aaron walked to the edge, letting the wind press against him. Below, the land stretched endlessly, scarred by rivers and sun. He could feel Silas standing a few feet behind him, but didn't turn. He didn't need to. It wasn't fear that had kept Aaron quiet these past days. It was uncertainty, not about what he felt, but about what would happen if he allowed himself to feel it completely. Now, standing at the edge of all that open sky, it seemed simpler. Not easy, but simpler. He heard footsteps approach, soft, deliberate. Then Silas was beside him. Not too close, not too far. Just enough. They stood like that for a long while, saying nothing. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. Eventually, Aaron spoke, his voice barely above the wind. "I don't know what this is," he said, the words strange and careful on his tongue. "But I don't want to keep pretending it's not real." Silas didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging something Aaron hadn't said out loud. Then, slowly, he turned to face him. Aaron met his eyes, steady, warm, uncertain in the same way he felt. "It's real," Silas said, his voice low but steady. "Even if we don't have the words for it yet." That was all. No confessions, no promises. Just truth, shared between them like breath. That night, they parked near an abandoned rest stop, the van positioned beneath a canopy of stars. The lantern inside flickered gently, casting a golden hue across the narrow space. Aaron sat cross-legged, sketching the horizon from memory in a worn notebook, while Silas tuned his guitar in the background. The closeness between them felt different now. Not charged, not unsure, just quiet and full, like the weight of knowing someone is choosing to stay, even without asking questions. Before sleep, they lay on opposite ends of the bed, facing each other. No words were exchanged, but as the light dimmed, their hands found each other in the space between. Fingers brushed, lingered, then held. There was no need to define anything. Not that night. Not yet. The van was still, wrapped in moonlight and wind. And for the first time in a long while, Aaron felt like he wasn't running from anything. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't lost. He was just here, with Silas, at the edge of something new, and that was enough.